Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong, Week in Review for Sunday, November 29, 2020. In this episode, we continue to discuss topics after the war in Artsakh, and we'll be talking to our guests about the following major topics: border demarcations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the scene in Yerevan, a COVID update, Armenia Fund support for the post-war economy. To talk about these issues, we have with us Asbed Kotchikian, a senior lecturer of political science and international relations at Bentley University in Massachusetts, where he teaches courses on the Middle East and the former Soviet space, and Hrant Mikaelian, a political scientist and multidisciplinary researcher in social sciences based in Yerevan. He is also a senior researcher at the Caucasus Institute. This episode is recorded on Sunday, November 29. Hello and welcome, everyone.
Hello, Asbed.
Hi.
Hello.
All right. With the territories surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh returning to mostly Azerbaijani control, we are witnessing the rise of border demarcation issues between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The most notable issue is the gold mine in Sotk. Will this be a continuing issue we see in months and years to come? Asbed Kotchikian, what do you think?
Well, definitely this is going to be an issue. Almost the entirety of the eastern border of Armenia Republic has not been in any kind of border issues there, mostly because after 1994 ceasefire, there was no border with Azerbaijan, with an international entity, let's call it that way. As the territorial transfer has been occurring in recent days, as we witnessed, this is going to become more and more of an issue, especially considering that Azerbaijan would think that it can dictate terms. Now, specifically about the gold mine and in Sotk, this is one of the elements of Soviet territorial demarcation. You had enclaves and exclaves, and more often than not, you would see borders or roads going from one country to the other to connect one village or one town in Armenia with another that went through Azerbaijan, Soviet Socialist Republic, or the railway that went through from north to south with Nakhichevan. So I feel that this is going to be a major legal issue, and I am concerned that we might not have the software nor the hardware in terms of lawyers or legal experts to deal with this issue. And it will go always to a Russian mediation or a brokered border demarcation.
Asbed, is this an issue on all of the borders or primarily the borders inside the Soviet Union?
This is one of the key issues here. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the internationally recognized borders of the constituent republics ended up being the Soviet republics' borders. And that actually was the internationally agreed upon status for all the post-Soviet countries to be recognized. Of course, this is not the only place where you had border issues in different post-Soviet countries, but in the eastern part where Armenia had direct border with Azerbaijan, the Davush region, for instance, there were never raised in the last 30 years, but I wouldn't be surprised if more issues are raised there as well.
What about the borders with Georgia, for example?
It's interesting. There are sections of the Georgian border that are not demarcated clearly. When you look at the two major crossings between Armenia and Georgia, the Bakratash-Sadakhlo area, it is clearly defined. But if you move a bit further to the east, it's the border there. There's a large area of no man's land that they haven't been able to figure it out. For anyone who has crossed the border between Georgia and Armenia, you go through Sadakhlo area, it's very much like the no man's land is a couple of hundred feet of walk. I had the misfortune of having to walk from the Georgian border crossing on Javakheti area.
It's Bavara on Armenian side.
And the Georgian side, do you know that by any chance?
Don't remember exactly.
I had the misfortune to walk through the no man's land. It's a good kilometer or two walk between the two actual borders.
So it's like a sort of a neutral zone you're talking about?
Yeah, the no man's land, because again, there was no demarcation there. This is very common, actually. You would see, for instance, between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, there used to be a huge chunk of land that was not defined. Who does it belong to? This is part of the international legal norms and are unfortunately to a large extent also part of the Soviet legacy.
I understand we have to withdraw to USSR borders, but why is it a priority right now to officially demarcating the borders between two countries? Is that like a clause in the statement that they signed? Or because I also saw Pashinyan talking about the necessity to do this and referring to specifically to the USSR borders. And I saw the deputy chief of staff also in his interview say that. But like, as far as I know, even during Soviet times, this border was contentious. Like, I was reading a Facebook post from the former, I believe, head of the Sotk mine, and he was saying even during Soviet times, there was a lot of, we have a lot of legal claims that we can bring up that the border is not what is currently perceived to be. So why is it a priority right now to demarcate the borders?
Let me jump in on Georgian border to add a couple of important things to what has been said, with which I of course agree. One of the issues on Armenian-Georgian border is that part of it is through some natural landmarks, including forests, and locals cut trees on the edge of the forest. Sometimes this might lead to technical increase of Georgian territory, sometimes of Armenian territory. Some 8 or 9 years ago, you would find a lot of publications on that, both in Armenian and Georgian newspapers. Another issue is that there are two major monasteries. One is Huchapavank, which Georgians claim to be Hujabi. Probably this is Armenian Chalcedonite Church. Another is Horakert, which is Armenian Apostolic Church, and it's very interesting architecture. Both are on very near to contested land. Within Soviet borders, one of those within Armenian borders, another within Georgian borders. But as far as I know, both are medieval Armenian monuments and very important ones, and I think it's very important to keep them. So far, the major issue is this, and also several territories bordering to villages of Georgian Azerbaijanis or to Armenian villages. So this is major issue there. So far, 2/3 of the border is demarked between Armenia and Georgia, and 1/3 is left.
Hrant, does this agreement signed on November 9 include some kind of clause that Armenia must recognize international borders between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Well, the agreement, or the statement to be more exact, is very not detailed, let's say. There should be prepared an agreement based on that, but I don't know on which stage the work is there. That's first issue. Another issue is that the competence of the Armenian side, of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of the Prime Minister, is doubtful. So they never declared the outcome of the war, the result. I've tried to calculate what the changes of the situation were on the ground, and it turned out that it's about 3,716 square kilometers that Armenian side has lost in Artsakh during the war. The 4,564 square kilometers more Armenian side is passing by the agreement, but there are of course a lot of places where the border is fluid. It has never been there because in Soviet times it was not a real border.
Yeah, it was a brotherly relations, right? So why have borders between brotherly countries?
True. So after the Soviet times, there was immediately a war, and it was not still that strict as it is now. So this border has to be defined first time. And what Azeris are doing, they are just taking probably Google Maps and trying to reach the places where it is drawn by Google Maps. But of course, it cannot be like that because you should demark. Many things have changed, and we need to discuss a lot of important issues.
Right.
One of those is, for example, the Sotk mine, of course. Another is the road between Kapan and Goris, which 6 kilometers of this road is passing through former Azerbaijani territory. There are several places where the lands of the villages is passing, and so on.
This is going to be a very contested issue, and probably Soviet-era maps and experts are going to be recruited for this in terms of, first of all, they have to agree which map both sides have to use if demarking the border. So this is going to be coming up a lot, even though in the statement that was signed, there were no specific aspects here. But I think this is a PR as well as a legal claim that Azerbaijan has been pushing. You know, they're working on so many different fronts, military, political, legalistic, and so on.
Is there a geopolitical importance to Sotk, or is it a money grab?
I think it's an issue of money, but also it's about the value, the emotional and the sentimental value, that you have land that belongs to us, no, it belongs to them.
That, and it's also Armenia's fourth largest taxpayer.
Right. So it's the mine aspect, the financial aspect of it.
Okay, let me move on from this topic to the political scene in Yerevan. For over 2 weeks now, the political scene in Armenia has been in turmoil. On the one hand, we see a hodgepodge of political parties calling for Prime Minister Pashinyan's resignation, and on the other hand, we see the government and the ruling party trying to make cosmetic changes by reshuffling the cabinet. Moreover, there have been several resignations from the National Assembly, but nothing that would shake their boat. What is Prime Minister Pashinyan's endgame here, Hrant?
I think Pashinyan will try to keep the power as much as possible. He has two reasons for that. One is that it's very questionable, debatable what his fate will be if he lost the power, because almost everyone who demands his resignation say he should be judged. That's one issue, and many things, including illegal orders and so on, will turn out to be truth, or maybe at least will be published as a truth. So he will be politically destroyed after he lost his power, at least politically. So that's a big threat for him. Another issue is that he has hopes that if he kept the power, then he might try to restart the economic growth after COVID. He aims to get help from US. He hopes that it's possible to play the same role as Saakashvili did after 2008 in Georgia, who also got some funds from US, rather significant funds, more than $4 billion. So there are rumors that Pashinyan is expecting the same amounts. That's why he hopes, let's say, to lead the economic reconstruction of Armenia, and after that he will be able to stay in power for a longer time. So now he feels that now it's very tight period. Now it's very hard time for him, but if he passed, then he will be able to stay longer.
There is an aspect that the political suicide was already there, but the political capital is gone. Even though, according to one recent survey, his approval rating is about 40%. His disapproval rating is almost as much. But that is quite a sizable support base that he can use. And he does have a base that he can rely on. Rationally speaking, I don't think there would be any fear on his life, but I think he's getting to borderline paranoia by fear of his life. That's put aside. He's trying to support himself, protect himself from all of these. I wouldn't put past the fact that it's a major gamble. Economic revival or recovery, if at all, is going to be there. It's going to be problematic. And I wouldn't be surprised in the coming months that whatever small development happens, let's say COVID cases go down or the economy jumps up a bit and so on and so forth, they're going to magnify that as a way for claiming that, okay, we're back on track. Yeah, we're lost. I take responsibility. But at the end of the day, let's look, at times of crisis, we need to continue with the track that we were on before.
Asbed, on that point though, is there really a viable opposition in Armenia to take over from the prime minister right now? The number of demonstrators, while in the thousands in the days immediately after the ceasefire that was signed, is now dwindling. There's less and less interest in these opposition rallies. Meanwhile, Pashinyan has presented a 15-point agenda, which he says he should be evaluated upon in about 6 months, and then we'll decide. So where would we go with this? If Pashinyan suddenly were to resign, who would take over?
This is, the age-old discussion. You always have these in organizations and institutions. Who's going to be there? Who's going to become the new leader? And I think that's a secondary issue. Regardless of what happens, things will happen. Someone will come up, even if there might not be the leader that everyone wants. You'll end up having the leader that you deserve or the leader that is available. And I think in the case of Pashinyan, I think specifically the opposition that exists as a viable opposition, there should be several divisions. One is the coalition of the 16, 17 parties that have been just demanding his resignation without an alternative. And I think people do realize that, and people are getting tired, I think, that, okay, fine, you can keep on shouting Nigo is a traitor, but then what is the alternative that you want to have? And one of the things I think they've been hit, the demands that Nigo Pashinyan resigns, and then there should be a new war and so on. Putin actually mentioned that very clearly that the beginning of hostilities is going to have major repercussions. So
I'll say two things. One is I do not think that the opposition support is dwindling. If anything, it's increasing a little bit. It's not in the orders of magnitude that it was during the revolution 2018 or during the what's referred to as the revolution. And the other thing, it's important to mention that the Armenian opposition officially is not talking about rescinding the statement.
Yeah, I didn't mention that. I said some groups in the opposition are mentioning that. So I agree. I mean, it's not the numbers. I said they were not gaining momentum. That's the issue. You don't have as an increase, and probably the weather is a factor. People's depression overall from
Martial law.
The martial law, although that has been rescinded by the administrative court in Armenia, that gatherings and protests are allowed.
Yeah, but officially it's still working.
No, the quarantine restrictions are still on.
Not quarantine, but the martial law. Officially, yes, the court has removed some of the restrictions, but the parliament has not removed the martial law itself. So it's a very fluid situation.
Right. They actually removed, right? Remember, at some point they had martial law because there was no quarantine law. Then they introduced the quarantine law. And then because of the war, they reintroduced the martial law. So you have now martial law and quarantine law, in which case the martial law has been contested. And at least gatherings have been allowed, at least the court, the administrative court, which is about 20 judges, some of whom are recent appointees in the last couple of years. They sided with opposition appeal about that. But the question is also, what opposition are we talking about? I think, the 16, 17 parties, they are the precipitators of gathering. That's one thing. But there's also some of them that are not part of it. Like, for instance, within the parliament, the role that the Bright Armenia is trying to play with its leader, Edmond Marukian, as positioning himself as an alternative. So when you talk about this, I think Marukian's statements seem to be going in that direction, that he could be an acceptable alternative between not Nigol and not the older regime or the return of some people from the previous regime.
There are a couple of options that are emerging. I think we're seeing Marukian step up and talk a little bit more, but also President Armin Sarkisyan has been a little more vocal, and in fact at this time I believe he's in Moscow talking to Russian Armenians and others. Hrant, I think the question would be, do you see a viable alternative to the Prime Minister if the opposition were to succeed to get him to resign?
Well, I do see there are several possibilities. One of those is temporary government, head of which could be, for example, Hovik Manucharyan or Hrant Mikaelian or someone else. There are several people who are well respected, who have big experience and who have big knowledge. So technically, they could lead the temporary government, which would take time to stabilize the situation in the country, and then hold the elections. Now, concerning Pashinyan himself, I've tried to follow his approval rates, and there have been polls by the MPG, and also I've looked at dynamics of his social networks, and the preliminary picture can be assessed as I try to quote very preliminary numbers. It's about 65% approval rate before the war, about 85% approval rate during the war, especially until the late October. About 80% by the end of war, before the annunciation of the statement, and about 60% after the annunciation of statement, after which the approval rate started declining slower, and it was about 45% by November 18, and as of now it's about 35%, and it's going to decline more probably. But who knows, maybe Pashinyan will be successful because he is using a very extensive propaganda machine, which includes anonymous YouTube channels, Telegram channels with big traffic, and also big number of fake users on social networks.
One thing I've observed about the polls is that they present the choice to be between the current regime, with Nikol Pashinyan, or a return to a previous regime. Hrant, I know you mentioned the possibility of an interim regime led by Hovik Manucharyan or Hrant Mikaelian, but getting past the interim period, is there a better choice than either the current or former regimes in forming a government of unity?
Well, I think the temporary government could be government of unity, and it could be formed by the different parties. I think the notion of former regime is not describing any real situation which can happen, because, for example, among 17 parties, not less than 10 don't have any connection to the former regime or are new. Maybe they talk to each other, I don't know, but they are not part of, in any way, they are not part of the former regime. Even more in reality, the one is representing the former regime, and even there, if we dig into it, for example, if we take Republican Party, if we look at the main patron-client groups within Republican parties, already by the beginning of 2019, it has lost about 4 out of 5 main groups. So I think the former regime cannot be reconstructed in any way. I don't think there is any such choice. In reality, Armenia has to first to reconcile, second to rebuild the institutions, and majority of institutions should be rebuilt from the ground, especially army, but not only army, because institutions in Armenia have not been very strong, and during the last 2.5 years they have weakened a lot, and especially the courts and police and many other institutions. So now any government which should appear should be more of technocratic and reconciling, and even afterwards there can be no one force which will take the power. In this way, this force will not be like, for example, like Pashinyan's party or like Republican Party, because it will be gain the coalition, and it might be even weak coalition, because if you have, let's say, four parties which together form, let's say, 50% of the electorate, this is very fluid coalition. So
just to retract a bit, the polls are not about pitting between the current regime and the old regime. Is in the social media. The questions in at least the MPG poll that I saw, it wasn't about Pashinyan's approval rating vis-a-vis who. It was his approval rating and disapproval rating. It was in absolute. So that gives us a better idea about how many people support him. So that's one. The other thing is about President Sarkisyan, actually, when he mentioned, he never asked for the resignation of Pashinyan. Rather, he said there should be a government of national unity, which main task would be to hold elections within, a couple of months. And I think the expectations of having an election now can be disastrous, or the implementation of any election now would be disastrous because of the fervor, because of the sentiments being so high. You would end up having, people having fistfights at polling stations.
Asbed, the second time that President Sarkisyan called for snap elections, he was giving them basically a year.
Right. Well, that's one of the things. It all depends. Now, if you have a government of national unity or a caretaking government, the main task would be to hold elections as soon as possible. It all depends on what is the mandate of a new government of technocrats, coalition, or whatnot.
I think that we're focusing too much on what happens if there is a new election, but the real question should be, should that be a consideration given if Pashinyan cannot stay? Should we think about what would happen, and if it's not a good outcome or high likelihood, then we don't do it? Because if you ask a lot of the opposition, Pashinyan has no moral basis to stay. Just his Facebook post yesterday, he was coming up with excuses about why he went to war. I don't know if any of you read that or want to comment on that. The real question, at least for me, is, does he have a legitimate basis to stay? And, you mentioned polls, and I think we discussed MPG polls before. MPG is the only institution that does polls. They do it over the phone. They do not provide the non-response rate for the polls. So it seems like they are able to manipulate the polls if they want to. And that has been done, because right before the 2018 events, the change of power in 2018, I think that the same agency was giving Ser Sarkisyan's team 75 or more percent rating. So I wanted to make sure that we ask the right question. And I don't know if the right question is, what would happen if Pashinyan resigned?
When it comes to the polls, yes, we can have a whole discussion about it, but that's what it is. We can only analyze what we have with the reservations that you mentioned, Hovik. But in terms of a resignation, in terms of creating the government of national unity, this is actually something that could only happen within the parliament. Morality and justifications like that, it's like Tina Turner's song. What does love have to do with it? What does morality have to do with governing? I understand that it does. I agree with you. But at the end of the day, we can scream until we turn blue in the face that, he has no moral authority, or has broken the trust of the people and so on. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, the parliament is where the decisions are made. The only way out, I would see, is that the parliament decides on a government of national unity with or without Pashinyan, although I highly doubt that he would be willing to work with anyone. And that would be a caretaking government until having new elections. Because in this environment, having a minority government like happened between May and December, when Pashinyan became prime minister, but he governed as a minority party, it would not have legitimacy for any long-term project and any long-term recovery.
I'm going to go back to what Hrant was saying, that the choices that we make today are going to be very important for the way we rebuild our institutions from the ground up, right? Because it seems like, given that Putin has given an unmistakable and clear message that the November agreement is essentially engraved in stone at this point, it's not going to make a difference as far as the outcome of the war goes as to who's going to be prime minister today or tomorrow.
It will make a difference, I think, in terms of negotiating the finer points of all the derivative agreements that come after this. Critics of Pashinyan say, someone who is the symbol of the humiliation of Armenia, when you see videos every day of Aliyev mocking Pashinyan, I don't know how you can negotiate with confidence in that environment. So,
well, I think at this point, the negotiations will be out of Armenia's hand. Honestly, if you were to look at it in terms of sovereignty, in terms of dictating the terms and so on, it's at this point, it's about whoever it will be dictated by Putin, by Russia, in accordance with what Aliyev would be saying.
They are out of Armenia's hand because Pashinyan is unable.
Correct.
He is absent at any point. if he does not do anything, you will see that everything is out of Armenia's hand. I will give you one example. In Stepanakert, now Russia is conducting reconstruction works. It's bringing materials via planes and taking it there through the cars and reconstructing Stepanakert. So it means that Russia is operating on the ground the things that Armenia could easily do. I'm sure that many things could have been done. Not even better, but could have been done at all. I mean, he's just abstaining from whatever is going on around this situation and telling that, oh, we cannot do anything. And it's not like it is in reality.
Because he doesn't have the authority or the perceived authority
Because he is
anymore.
not able and he is not very interested. He is not interested in Armenian future. This should be very clear because, for example, in the last stage of war, 1 week before the statement, he was absent at all. How can Armenia fight with no leadership? One of the questions. I mean, it's that he is abstaining, not that someone has pulled him out. Because he is not able to talk to Aliyev. Aliyev told that he will not talk to Pashinyan. And also he is not able to talk to Putin. And in reality, there are very few people whom you can find who are willing to talk to Pashinyan. So this is a major issue. He is just away.
Okay. There have been many replacements of the ministers: defense, foreign affairs, emergency situations, education, economy, labor and social affairs. I mean, we've replaced the police chief, the national security chief, many deputies. Are there any notable changes? Because most of them, it seems to me, are relatively cosmetic and geared towards keeping the power in the prime minister's hands rather than making a difference from a policy perspective.
I think it is important because it shows us the development of internal politics of Armenia. First of all, it's important to note that majority of them have left their positions. They were not fired by Pashinyan, but they themselves have written a statement that they are leaving. This shows the continuation of the process of deinstitutionalization of Armenia. Institutions are weak as ever in reality, except to what you've said, that he is trying to keep the power. So he is removing, a couple of ministers whom he removed himself. Social affairs and education had the lowest approval rates. So he's trying to limit the threats to his government on this side, because previously he would keep them with his high approval rate. But the rest have left themselves.
Hrant, I was specifically thinking about the Minister of Education, Aray Harutyunyan, whom he relieved from the ministership but immediately appointed him as an advisor to the Prime Minister. So it seems like he is just recycling the names for cosmetic change perspective.
True, this one is true, but this also reveals a big process that many, in reality hundreds of officials on different places, not all do that publicly, but they resign, and the state apparatus is weak as ever and is less able to conduct any activity. In reality, we have very many positions which are not filled in Security Council, in National Security Service, in police, and also in Ministry of Defense, which are crucial, in Foreign Affairs Ministry, and in many other entities. And this will continue, which I think shows difference between these protests and the protests which occurred in 2018. Now, these protests are more elitarian protests, while those protests were appealing to masses. That's why those protests had more participants. Although it should be mentioned that those protests had many participants only in the end, during several days, and due to very effective technological mobilizations. But going back to here, to these protests, it's important that since institutions are weak, the one day, whenever it happens, protests will escalate, which still might happen at any point, because there are many bad news and no good news expected. The authorities might just collapse. So it will not be the result of very strong push from the street, but it will be result of very weak ability of self-defense of the government. Because if we remember, for example, 2018, at that time there were no resignations, or almost no resignations at the top level, while now we have a lot of them.
One of the things that we can tell is that by implementing these cosmetic changes, he's trying to get a couple of points of political capital here or there. Pashinyan is trying to do that, basically trying to, by doing so, as Hrant mentioned earlier, in terms of buying time to have some developments when it comes to issues of economy or COVID or whatnot. So, for instance, the Minister of Health hasn't been replaced yet. And also, this is something that has happened before under previous administrations. The notable one I remember under the former President Serge Sarkisian, when you had Armenia Fund, who was the Minister of Education, he was replaced, but he was not out. He wasn't replaced because he wasn't doing a good job, but to open room to include more coalition members and so on and so forth. So at least one of the things that I would have liked to see as a first step of having sort of a coalition national unity government is to appoint at least non-inner circle people. So yes, it is cosmetic. You might get some traction from it. The question would be how much of a development you can do in a matter of 2-3 months, unless you discover some new cure in Armenia that people will start buying it in droves and Armenia will be put on the map. I don't think that this is going to lead anywhere. All other things being equal, Pashinyan and his ruling coalition in the parliament feel comfortable. And if anything, they have had more solidarity, at least in the parliament, even though there have been some resignations and some people breaking from the parliament.
Okay, so I'm going to move to a COVID update. Before and through the first half of the war, the coronavirus pandemic burned through Armenia like wildfire. The numbers of new infections and deaths soared. Recoveries languished, but for the last couple of weeks it seems like the numbers have turned around a little bit. What happened, and is Armenia doing something right at present, or is this all seasonal? Hrant, you talked to us about a COVID update last month. What's going on?
Well, I don't think Armenia is doing something at all. I didn't see any policies except to ban on schools for 1 month. That has affected the growth rate of COVID cases. But the main driver of changes there were several drivers of changes. One of those was a ban on schools, but another was that during the war, the social activity level in Yerevan and in overall Armenia has decreased significantly by 1/3. So it means that there were less and less social interaction between people, and this leads to decrease of spread of the virus. Another reason is that as of now, according to my calculations, around 17% of population have immunity to COVID. 17 to 18. So it means that it already contributes to decrease of speed of spread of the virus. Still not enough to stop it. So I think it will be more or less stable after these days, and it's already has stabilized on this level, which is lower than the peak, but still rather high at around 1,200 cases daily. So I think we will have this situation of lower speed than at the peak, but still active virus until the end of the winter.
I have one question about statistics and how things are measured. There was one interesting day, I think it was November 19, when there were reported 8,319 recoveries, and yet the reported number of tests was 3,786. I noted these down because they were kind of strange. How do they know the number of people who have recovered without testing them?
They don't do any tests when they tell you are recovered. The length of the illness is known from China yet. So they say after 3 weeks or 3 weeks and 2 days or something, after first symptoms, they write that they have the date of onset of symptoms, and after 3 weeks they say you have recovered. Now that day was they have, let's say, combined patients from several days, and they wrote that they have all recovered in 1 day. Probably it was Monday, so it has many technical reasons in it.
That's interesting. So there's no level of assurance that this number is true. It's a presumed number.
All numbers of COVID in Armenia are not very exact, let's say. For example, even number of deaths, when we compare, let's say, Armenia with Georgia, Georgia shows all deaths in one line, while Armenia has deaths by COVID and then deaths by side causes, which is about 1/4 of all deaths. And in Georgian case, they are all combined. So this is one difference. Another is that not all cases are indicated. So I have preliminary calculation of the real number of excess deaths as of now, and it's already exceeds 4,000. Also, the number of cases, if you have, let's say, 3,500 tests a day, you cannot have more registered cases than this, especially because some people are making tests not because they feel bad, but because, for example, they are MPs or because they crossed borders and so on. So, in reality, Armenia does not do as many tests as it's needed to track all cases. So, there are many not knowns, let's say, and only after publication of the final demographic statistics we can be more or less sure that, let's say, this or that data is valid.
Hovik, I know you follow statistics in COVID in Armenia very closely. Do you have anything to add?
The only thing I would add is a little bit of unsubstantiated. There was some news that there was some fraud going on in terms of COVID testing during the war, specifically to delay army service. I don't know how significant that is, but just after the war, the number of COVID cases went down. So there may be some slight bump during the war attributed to that aspect. I would agree with Hrant that we're not doing nearly enough testing to know for sure. And it's only people who need to travel and people who have been diagnosed with symptoms and they need a formal diagnosis. But what I also know is a lot of people who even have symptoms, they may avoid taking the official test and they're not bound to take it just so that they're not forced to be in quarantine for 2 weeks. So if you have symptoms of pneumonia, it's not mandatory for you to get tested in order to determine whether it's COVID or not.
Moving on, around a month ago we talked about potential uses for the funds raised for Armenia Fund. One option I raised was shoring up Armenia's financial sector to support the Armenian dram and the economy overall. Recently, we heard that Armenia Fund had directed more than $100 million to the Armenian economy, and the Armenian Finance Ministry said it was going to finance the government's infrastructure, social, and healthcare expenditures necessitated by the war. Can you elaborate on this? What do you think will be happening to these Armenia funds? And is it going to help to shore up the Armenian finance sector?
Well, first of all, it will collapse the trust in Armenian state institutions, at least on the side of diaspora, because people have donated not to the government, but to the people, to the war, to the people in need. And the way it has been done is, I think, is unprecedented. Now, concerning the spendings, they just transferred the money to the budget. So, since this year, the budget was over-optimistic in the beginning, and after the COVID and war, it's not able to complete it, to get all incomes from the economy. They will just fill the budget, so they will keep it as an income of the budget. They will spend it on the regular expenses, including pensions, salaries, including salaries of the officials, and so on. It will not be directed to keeping the dram rate, because for that they have central bank funds, which are rather big yet, but have decreased, of course, during this year. And they are already spending money on keeping dram rate, but not on Armenian Fund means.
I didn't keep a good tab, but I did read recently that for the past quarter, the Armenian revenues had exceeded expectations, and I'm wondering if these funds are being counted as part of budget revenues.
Probably because they transferred it to the budget. So maybe this is the reason, because there is no other way. I did not see the last numbers, but what I've seen before, even before the war, government was not able to collect all the money which was projected by the budget, and by far not all the money. So it was, let's say, 10% or even less than it should have been. So I cannot expect that there was something happening except to these funds that could aid the budget the way it could overpass the expectations.
This is not an uncommon practice. I mean, this is not an uncommon practice in general, but also in the case of Armenia. Back in the early 2000s, when there was a $200 million injection into the economy by the Lindsay Foundation, by Hrant Mikaelian.
No, sorry, that's different. It is different completely.
Well, let me explain why in terms of the analogy. It's different, but it was counted twice. First, it got into, at the time, it was counted as part of the budget, and also what was counted as a FDI, as a foreign direct investment. So practice of doing this, even though, one could argue that the Armenia Fund is not a private donor, but at the end of the day, it's also about the government, finding an excuse or finding the needed where it's needed, to spend it on where it's needed. And as Hrant mentioned, they've been spending it on salaries, they've been spending it on, other stuff, day-to-day operations of the government.
I think that in 20 years, we should have had a bit stronger trust in institutions, including the institution of the Armenian Fund. And I agree with Hrant that it severely weakens trust in the organization, because when I donate to Armenia Fund, I expect their charter to kick in. I expect them to have oversight over that spending. Even if they transfer the money to the government, they should have had some oversight on how, maybe the government is the optimal entity that can spend that money on Artsakh refugees, for instance, or even military. Right. But without any oversight on that money, this is just pure capitulation of that fund and capitulation of trust from the diaspora.
Let me just say that in the post-war period, on November 23rd, the telethon for Armenia Fund raised $23 million, which was unprecedented. The previous high was, I think, $15 or $16 million in many years ago. So at least at this moment in time, it doesn't look like there has been capitulation on the fund.
Well, we're still riding high on the war thing, and I think that people have the correct goodwill in terms of, okay, we still have a war going on, even though the statement is signed. I really think that after this period, there will be more questions asked. It just doesn't seem like proper financial acumen to do this without any oversight.
Okay. Well, that and many other things, unfortunately, we will not have time for today. That is all the time we have, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for giving the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks.
In
That concludes our program for this episode of Groong Week in Review. We hope it has helped your understanding of some of the issues from this previous week. We look forward to your feedback and suggestions for issues to cover in greater depth. Contact us on our website at groong.org, that's Groong, and on our Facebook page, ANN-Groong, or in our Facebook group, Groong-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. I'm Hovik Manucharyan, and on behalf of everyone in this episode, I wish you a good week. Thank you for listening, and talk to you next week.